Okay, so now let's talk about after you have made your hypothesis, you're doing your experiment, you are going to be collecting and analyzing that data. So when you're collecting, you're going to collect and organize into a data table. Okay, well, how do you set up that data table? Well, we already know what our variables are. So, the easiest way to set up a data table would be to write your independent variables on this side, on the left side, okay? And then on the right side is where you're going to put your measurements. This helps you organize your data because this is not a graph. This is a data table. This helps you as you're measuring. Let's say that, for instance, you're doing different types of movies. So then the different types of movies would go on the left side, and then your measurement would go on the right side, whether you're doing the rating or maybe the time that it takes, or whatever it is, your dependent variable, you are putting it on this right side of your data table. This is not a graph. Remember, this is just to help you organize your data so that you can manipulate it and change it and put it into a graph so that you can visually see the relationship. When you just see a whole bunch of numbers and measurements and descriptions, it's sometimes harder to see the relationship between your data because you have a hypothesis that you're trying to test. So it's important to see whether your data supports it or doesn't support it. So when you do that, you're going to, and you can do multiple trials. Remember that. You're going to do your experiment several times. Okay. Make sure that you put units with your measurements. Alright, and you want to be detailed as possible. Alright, so then you always collect your data into a data table, okay? So that would be like step 1, okay? Step 2 would be to graph it. So let's talk about the different types of graphs. Alright, so you have your bar graph, and that's where you're going to compare different categories. Alright, so this is a bar graph. That's an example of what one would look like, okay? So where you're comparing the different categories. Alright, so another one is a line graph. And this is used to show change over time. And this one is very important because if you deal anything with time, then you would do a line graph if you're showing how something has changed over time. So if you have a line graph, that's where you graph it as in your X and your Y, and you put your dot, and then you look at your next X and your Y, and you put your dot, okay, and then you're able to see that increase or decrease. This would be a super quick example of what a line graph looks like. And then your other one would be a circle graph. This one doesn't get used often, as often as the other one, but it shows parts of a whole. So I remember this one as if I'm going to be using percentages. If I'm using percentage, like 50% of the class, likes this movie, or 25% of the class, does homework for 30 minutes. Sorry. Alright, so those are the three kinds of graphs. Now, when you set up your graph, any kind, it doesn't matter whether it's a bar graph or a line graph, okay? This is your x-axis, and this is your y-axis, alright? This is where your independent variable goes. And this is where your dependent variable goes. Okay, so whenever you're looking at your data table, because you set it up like this, this would be along this way, and your dependent variable will be graphed this way. Now remember, you're going to look because you want to pick a range of what would be the best thing to go by. Would you would you go by 2s? Would you go by 5s? Would you go by 10s? So you want to subtract your highest and lowest to find the range. Okay, so your highest number and your lowest number, and that's going to help you find your range. You don't want your graph to have these huge empty sections because you went by too little, or all of your points are very close to each other because you didn't have a wide enough range. So the purpose of a graph is to help you visualize. Okay, it helps you see an increase or a decrease, or that one category was higher than the other. When you're just looking at numbers, you have to study them a little bit more closely to see whether there's a relationship. So let's move on. You can just kind of add this anywhere you need to. When you analyze, you are looking for a relationship or trend in the data. Okay, so because you're able to, you can see what happened. Okay, and then you'll be able to use your graph to help you write your conclusion. It will help you see that, as the amount of sunlight changed, so did the plant growth. You'll be able to actually see that because as the numbers are different down here, they will also have a different height. So when you graph, it's helping you visualize the data that you collected in that data table. Okay, so remember that there's a bar graph, and that's what we use to compare different categories. There's a line graph, and that's what we use to show change over time. And a circle graph that shows parts of a whole. So that one is if you're doing a percentage of like the whole class or the whole school. Alright, and so then when you set it up, your x-axis is going horizontal and your y-axis goes vertical. And you want to make sure you always use labels so that whoever is looking at your graph can figure out what you did and what those numbers mean or what that line means. And so after you have copied this down into your notebook, you will get the practice graphs and you will see how good you are.